sometimes the most extraordinary moments of human dignity unfold in the most public places, witnessed by those who embody duty and honor themselves. What happens when a man who gave everything for his country faces humiliation in front of the very guards who protect royalty? This is the story of James Mitchell, a decorated veteran who lost his leg in Afghanistan, and how one moment of cruelty became a testament to the unbreakable spirit that defines true heroism. In the shadow of Buckingham Palace, where tradition meets modernity and tourists gather to witness the changing of the guard, an unexpected confrontation would remind everyone present that courage comes in many forms. This isn't just a story about standing up to a bully, it's about what happens when ordinary people become witnesses to extraordinary character, and how sometimes the most powerful victories are won not with weapons, but with words, dignity, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing who you truly are. The red-coated sentries standing at attention that day had no idea they were about to witness something that would stay with them far longer than any ceremonial duty, a reminder of why they serve, and what honor really means. James Mitchell adjusted his prosthetic leg as he stepped off the red double-decker bus at the Wellington Arch stop. The familiar ache in his residual limb reminded him that he had been walking more than usual today, but he didn't mind. After 18 months of rehabilitation and countless physical therapy sessions, he had finally felt ready for this trip to London. His daughter Sarah had been planning this visit for months, wanting to show her father the sights he had only seen in photographs during his deployment years. The morning air was crisp for late September, and the autumn sun cast long shadows across the mall as James walked slowly toward Buckingham Palace. He wore his regimental tie beneath a navy wool coat, a small but important detail that connected him to the man he used to be. His walking stick, polished wood with a brass handle, helped him maintain his balance as he navigated the uneven cobblestones that lined the approach to the palace gates. Sarah walked beside him, her camera ready to capture every moment of their father-daughter adventure. She had taken time off from her nursing job specifically for this trip, knowing how much it meant to her father to visit the places he had dreamed about during those long nights in the hospital. James had spoken often about wanting to see the Royal Guard, to witness firsthand the same traditions that had inspired him to serve his own country with such dedication. As they approached the palace, the crowd began to thicken. Tourists from around the world gathered in anticipation of the changing of the guard ceremony, their excitement palpable in the air. James found himself swept up in the atmosphere, remembering his own days standing at attention, the weight of responsibility and honor that came with wearing the uniform. He had served 3 tours of duty, each one taking him further from home but closer to understanding what it truly meant to serve something greater than yourself. The explosion that had taken his leg had also taken 3 of his fellow soldiers. James rarely spoke about that day, but the memories lived just beneath the surface of his consciousness, emerging at unexpected moments. The sound of marching feet, the snap of flags in the wind, the sight of soldiers standing perfectly still despite the chaos around them, these things brought both comfort and pain, reminding him of everything he had gained and lost in service to his country. Sarah noticed her father's contemplative mood as they found a spot along the palace railings. She had learned to read his silences, understanding when he was remembering his brothers in arms and when he was simply taking in the beauty of a moment. Today seemed to be a mixture of both. The crowd pressed closer as the ceremony time approached, and James shifted his weight carefully, making sure his prosthetic was secure before the inevitable jostling began. A group of teenagers pushed past them, laughing and taking selfies without regard for the people around them. James smiled tolerantly, remembering when he had been their age, full of energy and seemingly invincible. One of the boys stepped back suddenly, while lining up a photo, bumping directly into James and causing him to stumble slightly. The young man turned immediately, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, sir," the teenager said, reaching out instinctively to steady James. "I didn't see you there. Are you okay?" James nodded, gripping his walking stick more firmly. "No harm done, son. Just excited to get that perfect shot, I imagine." The boy's eyes dropped to James's prosthetic, visible beneath his trouser leg, and his expression grew more serious. "Were you in the military, sir?" "I was indeed," James replied, his voice carrying a quiet pride. "Served in Afghanistan." The teenager's entire demeanor changed. He straightened his shoulders and looked James directly in the eye. "Thank you for your service, sir. My grandfather was in the Navy." Sarah watched this exchange with a warm feeling in her chest. These were the moments that reminded her why her father's service had meant so much, not just to their family, but to complete strangers who understood the sacrifice involved. The boy rejoined his friends, but she noticed him explaining something to them quietly, and how their behavior immediately became more respectful. The sound of approaching drums began to fill the air, signaling the start of the ceremony. The crowd pressed forward slightly, everyone eager to get the best view possible of the colorful spectacle about to unfold. James felt the familiar stirring in his chest that came with military pageantry, the same feeling he had experienced as a young recruit watching his first parade, the same pride that had carried him through years of service. The royal guards appeared in their distinctive red tunics and tall bearskin hats, their movements precise and synchronized after years of training and tradition. James watched with professional appreciation, noting the exact timing of their steps, the way they held their rifles, the absolute stillness they maintained despite the chaos of tourists and traffic around them. These men represented centuries of British military tradition, just as he had represented the values and commitment of his own country's armed forces. Sarah snapped photos steadily, but she found herself watching her father's face more than the ceremony itself. She could see the emotions playing across his features: pride, nostalgia, a deep respect for the discipline and dedication on display. This was what he had been hoping to experience, this connection to something larger than himself, this reminder that service and sacrifice were universal languages spoken by military personnel around the world. An older woman standing next to them noticed James's military bearing and struck up a conversation. She introduced herself as Margaret, explaining that her late husband had served in the Royal Navy for 30 years. The three of them began discussing military traditions, sharing stories and observations about the ceremony unfolding before them. Margaret's knowledge of British military history impressed James, and he found himself relaxing into the kind of conversation that had become rare since his retirement from active duty. The guards completed their formation and began the formal ceremony. The precision was breathtaking, every movement calculated, every position exact. James lost himself in the spectacle, remembering his own ceremonies, his own moments of standing perfectly still while representing something much larger than his individual existence. The pain in his leg faded into the background as he focused on the pageantry before him. Sarah captured photo after photo, but she also made sure to take several pictures of her father watching the ceremony. She knew these images would become treasured memories, evidence of a day when James had felt fully connected to his military identity again. The journey to this point had been long and difficult, filled with physical therapy appointments, sleepless nights, and moments of doubt about his future. Seeing him standing here, fully engaged and clearly moved by the experience, felt like a victory for both of them. As the ceremony reached its midpoint, the crowd began to shift and resettle. People who had been standing for an extended period started to stretch and move around, creating small eddies of movement within the larger group. James remained focused on the guards, but he was aware of the increasing restlessness around him. He adjusted his grip on his walking stick and prepared for the possibility of having to move if the crowd dynamics changed significantly. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the palace courtyard and highlighting the bright colors of the guards' uniforms. The atmosphere remained festive and respectful, with most tourists maintaining an appropriate level of quiet observation during the formal portions of the ceremony. James felt grateful to be part of this experience, surrounded by people from around the world who had come to witness this uniquely British tradition. Margaret continued to share interesting details about the history of the guard ceremony, explaining the significance of various elements and pointing out subtle details that casual observers might miss. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and James found himself asking questions and engaging with the material in a way that reminded him of his early military training, when everything had been new and fascinating. The morning was unfolding exactly as Sarah had hoped when she planned this trip. Her father seemed more relaxed and engaged than he had been in months, genuinely enjoying himself and connecting with fellow military enthusiasts. She made a mental note to thank Margaret later for her kindness in including James in her commentary and observations. These unexpected connections often meant the most during travel experiences. As the ceremony continued, James reflected on the path that had brought him to this moment. The explosion, the hospital stays, the difficult process of learning to walk again, the retirement from active duty, all of it had led to this peaceful morning in London, standing beside his daughter and watching young soldiers carry on traditions that stretched back centuries. There was something deeply satisfying about witnessing the continuation of military excellence, even as his own active service had come to an end. The guards maintained their perfect stillness, their faces impassive beneath the iconic bearskin hats. James admired their discipline and wondered about their individual stories, where they had come from, what had motivated them to serve, what they thought about during these long ceremonies. Military service created a unique bond between people who had never met, a shared understanding of duty and commitment that transcended national boundaries. Sarah noticed that her father seemed lost in thought and decided not to interrupt his reverie. She continued taking photographs while keeping an eye on the crowd around them. The morning had been perfect so far, and she hoped it would continue without incident. Her father deserved to have this experience exactly as he had imagined it, surrounded by the respect and dignity that had always been so important to him. The peaceful atmosphere began to shift when a group of loud tourists pushed their way through the crowd, clearly intoxicated despite the early hour. Their behavior immediately stood out against the respectful quiet that had settled over most of the gathered spectators. James noticed them first because of their volume, raucous laughter, and crude jokes that seemed completely inappropriate for the solemnity of the ceremony taking place. Leading this group was a man in his late 30s, wearing an expensive tracksuit and gold jewelry that caught the morning sunlight. His face was flushed red, whether from alcohol or aggression was unclear, and he seemed to take pleasure in pushing past other tourists without apology. His companions followed in his wake, laughing at his crude comments and encouraging his increasingly disruptive behavior. Sarah felt her father tense beside her as the group approached their section of the crowd. She had learned to recognize the signs when James was assessing a potential threat. His military training never completely switched off, and his posture shifted subtly from relaxed observation to alert readiness. The walking stick in his hand seemed to become less of a mobility aid and more of a potential defensive tool, though she doubted anyone else would notice such a subtle change. The man in the tracksuit, who his friends called Marcus, seemed to be working himself up to something. He made increasingly loud comments about the ceremony, questioning why anyone would want to watch grown men playing dress-up and suggesting that the tourists were all wasting their time. His voice carried clearly across the immediate area, and James could see other spectators beginning to look uncomfortable with the disruption. Margaret, the elderly woman who had been sharing her knowledge of military history, stepped slightly closer to James and Sarah. Her instincts, honed by decades of experience with difficult people, told her that this situation might escalate beyond mere rudeness. She had seen enough of life to recognize when someone was looking for trouble, and Marcus was displaying all the warning signs of a person spoiling for a confrontation. The ceremony continued despite the growing disturbance, with the royal guards maintaining their perfect discipline and focus. James admired their ability to block out distractions and remain completely committed to their duty, even as the situation around them became increasingly tense. It reminded him of his own training, where soldiers learned to perform their duties regardless of external circumstances or provocations. Marcus and his group had positioned themselves directly behind James and Sarah, continuing their loud commentary and crude jokes. The man seemed to feed off the discomfort he was causing others, his behavior becoming more aggressive as he realized he was disrupting the experience for the respectful tourists around him. His friends occasionally tried to quiet him down, but their efforts were half-hearted and ineffective. The situation took a more serious turn when Marcus noticed James's prosthetic leg. His bloodshot eyes fixed on the visible portion of the artificial limb, and his expression shifted from general belligerence to something more focused and malicious. He nudged his closest companion and pointed discreetly, whispering something that caused the other man to look uncomfortable and shake his head in disapproval. James felt the change in attention immediately. His years of military experience had taught him to be acutely aware of his surroundings, and he could sense when someone was focusing on him specifically rather than just causing general disruption. The hair on the back of his neck stood up slightly, a warning signal that had served him well during his deployments and was proving relevant even here in peaceful London. Sarah noticed the shift as well, though she couldn't immediately identify what had changed. She moved slightly closer to her father, a protective instinct that she had developed during his recovery period when he had been more vulnerable to both physical and emotional attacks. The camera in her hand suddenly felt less important than staying alert to whatever was developing around them. Margaret's sharp eyes had also caught the change in Marcus's demeanor. She had lived through enough difficult times to recognize when someone was moving from general troublemaking to targeted harassment. Her late husband's military service had taught her about the particular vulnerability that disabled veterans faced from people who questioned their sacrifice or saw their injuries as weakness rather than evidence of service. The ceremony reached a particularly solemn moment, with the guards performing a precise series of movements that required absolute silence from the crowd to appreciate fully. Most of the tourists respectfully quieted their conversations and focused on the spectacle before them. Marcus, however, seemed to interpret this moment of quiet as an opportunity to make his voice heard even more clearly. "Look at that," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the immediate area. "All this fuss over a bunch of toy soldiers. And, look who's here to watch, we've got our own broken soldier right here in the crowd." The words hit James like a physical blow, but his training kicked in immediately. He straightened his shoulders and kept his eyes focused on the ceremony, refusing to give Marcus the satisfaction of a reaction. Years of military discipline had taught him that responding to provocation often escalated situations unnecessarily, and he was determined not to let this man ruin the experience for Sarah or the other respectful tourists around them. Sarah felt her face flush with anger, but she followed her father's lead and tried to maintain her composure. She had seen how much this trip meant to James, and she was not going to let some drunk tourist destroy what had been a perfect morning. Her grip tightened on her camera, and she found herself calculating whether she could capture evidence of the harassment if it continued to escalate. Margaret stepped forward slightly, positioning herself where she could intervene if necessary. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. "Young man," she said clearly, "there are children present, and this is a solemn ceremony. Perhaps you could show some respect." Marcus turned his attention to Margaret with obvious delight, apparently thrilled to have drawn a response from someone in the crowd. "Oh, wonderful," he said with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Now we have the old lady brigade defending Captain Pegleg over there. This just keeps getting better." The crude nickname hung in the air like a slap, and James felt his jaw tighten involuntarily. He had heard variations of such insults during his rehabilitation, usually from people who had never served their country or faced any real hardship themselves. The words stung not because they were particularly clever, but because they reduced everything he had sacrificed to a childish joke for someone else's entertainment. Several other tourists began to look uncomfortable with the escalating situation. A family with young children moved away from the immediate area, and an elderly couple exchanged worried glances. The respectful atmosphere that had characterized the morning was rapidly deteriorating, and it was becoming clear that Marcus was not going to be easily discouraged from his harassment. The royal guards continued their ceremony with unwavering professionalism, but James noticed that one of the younger soldiers had his eyes slightly unfocused in a way that suggested he was listening to what was happening in the crowd. Military training taught soldiers to maintain awareness of their surroundings even while performing ceremonial duties, and the guard was clearly monitoring the disturbance without appearing to break his focus. Marcus seemed to interpret the lack of immediate response from James as weakness, and his behavior became even more aggressive. He stepped closer to the veteran, invading his personal space in a way clearly designed to provoke a reaction. His friends looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, but none of them seemed willing or able to control his behavior effectively. "What's the matter, hero?" Marcus continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you left that back in Afghanistan too, along with your leg." The reference to Afghanistan hit James particularly hard, bringing back memories of the explosion that had killed his brothers in arms and changed his life forever. His knuckles whitened as he gripped his walking stick more tightly, fighting the urge to respond with the kind of force that his military training had made second nature. The discipline that had served him so well in combat was now being tested in a completely different kind of battle. Sarah could see the tension building in her father's posture and made a decision that would prove crucial to how the situation developed. Rather than continuing to ignore Marcus or trying to move away, she pulled out her phone and began recording the interaction. Her nursing background had taught her the importance of documentation, and her instincts told her that having evidence of the harassment might prove important. Margaret noticed Sarah's action and followed suit, discreetly activating the recording function on her own mobile device. As someone who had lived through decades of social change, she understood the power of bearing witness to injustice, and she was prepared to ensure that Marcus's behavior was properly documented if the situation continued to escalate. The ceremony was reaching its climax, with the guards performing their final synchronized movements before the changing of the watch would be complete. The timing seemed particularly cruel, as what should have been the highlight of James's experience was being overshadowed by the aggressive behavior of someone who clearly had no understanding of what military service meant or cost. Marcus's friends were beginning to look genuinely concerned about his behavior, and one of them grabbed his arm in an attempt to pull him away from the confrontation he seemed determined to create. "Come on, mate," the friend said quietly. "Leave it alone. Let's just watch the show and move on." But Marcus shook off the restraining hand with obvious irritation. "No way," he said loudly. "I'm tired of pretending that these damaged goods are heroes. Look at him, can't even stand up properly without a stick. What kind of soldier is that?" The words seemed to echo in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their immediate section of the crowd. Other tourists had stopped their conversations and were staring at the unfolding confrontation with a mixture of shock and disgust. The contrast between Marcus's crude behavior and the dignity of the ceremony taking place just yards away could not have been more stark. James felt something shift inside him at that moment. The discipline that had kept him silent was still there, but it was being joined by something else, a quiet determination that had carried him through the worst moments of his recovery. He had not survived combat, explosion, amputation, and months of rehabilitation only to be humiliated by someone who had clearly never faced any real challenge in his life. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything James had learned about courage, dignity, and the true meaning of strength. The royal guards continued their ceremony, unaware that they were about to witness a different kind of demonstration of military values, one that would remind everyone present why some battles are worth fighting, even when the weapons are only words and the battlefield is a public street. James turned slowly to face Marcus, his movement deliberate and controlled despite the artificial leg. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority that had once commanded respect from soldiers under his leadership, a tone that seemed to cut through the noise of the crowd and the morning traffic around the palace. "I lost my leg serving my country," James said clearly, his words measured and precise. "I lost it along with 3 of my brothers in arms when an improvised explosive device detonated beneath our vehicle during a patrol in Helmand province. Their names were Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, Corporal David Williams, and Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez. They were good men, better men than I'll ever be, and they never made it home to see their families again." The directness and dignity of James's response seemed to take Marcus by surprise. The bully had clearly expected either silence or an angry outburst that would justify his continued harassment. Instead, he found himself facing someone who spoke with the calm certainty of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone, especially not to a stranger who had never faced real adversity. Marcus's face flushed darker, whether from embarrassment at the unexpected response or anger at being challenged, it was difficult to tell. His friends had gone completely quiet, and several of them were taking steps back, clearly wanting to distance themselves from what was rapidly becoming an uncomfortable situation. The crude laughter that had characterized their group dynamic had died completely. "Oh, spare me the sob story," Marcus said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. "You signed up for it, didn't you? Nobody forced you to go play soldier in some desert. And now you want everyone to feel sorry for you because it didn't work out the way you planned." Sarah felt her anger spike at the casual dismissal of her father's sacrifice, but she maintained her recording, understanding instinctively that documenting this encounter was more important than intervening immediately. Margaret had moved closer, her own phone capturing the exchange, her face set in lines of disapproval that spoke to decades of experience with people who confused cruelty with strength. The crowd around them had grown noticeably quiet. Other tourists were no longer pretending to ignore the confrontation, and many were looking on with obvious disgust at Marcus's behavior. Several people had their phones out, though whether they were recording or preparing to call for help was unclear. The ceremony continued in the background, but it had become secondary to the drama unfolding in the crowd. James took a single step closer to Marcus, his walking stick tapping once against the pavement. The sound seemed unusually loud in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their immediate area. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm, but there was something in his tone that made several people in the crowd straighten their shoulders unconsciously. "You're absolutely right," James said, his words carrying clearly in the morning air. "I did sign up for it. I volunteered to serve my country, just like every man and woman in my unit. We signed up knowing that we might be called upon to pay a price for that service. Some of us paid with time away from our families, some with physical injuries, and some with their lives." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But, do you know what we didn't sign up for? We didn't sign up to be protected by people like you. We signed up to protect people who were worth protecting. People who understood that freedom and safety don't come free, and that someone has to be willing to pay the cost." The words hit Marcus like a series of physical blows, and his swagger began to falter visibly. He had expected to intimidate a disabled man, to mock someone he saw as weak and damaged. Instead, he found himself facing someone whose strength was so evident that it made his own posturing look childish and pathetic by comparison. Margaret stepped forward at this point, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Young man," she said directly to Marcus, "my husband served 30 years in the Royal Navy. He would have been appalled by your behavior today. This gentleman has shown you more courtesy than you deserve, and far more dignity than you have shown him." One of Marcus's friends finally found the courage to speak up. "Marcus, mate, come on. This has gone far enough. Let's just leave it alone and move on." The friend's voice carried genuine embarrassment, and he kept glancing around at the crowd of disapproving faces that had gathered to witness the confrontation. But Marcus seemed unable to back down gracefully, perhaps feeling that retreating now would damage his reputation with his companions. "Dignity," he said with a forced laugh that sounded hollow and unconvincing. "What's dignified about hobbling around on one leg, looking for sympathy from strangers? Real heroes don't need walking sticks." The crude comments seemed to crystallize something in the crowd that had been building throughout the confrontation. A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped forward, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I beg your pardon," he said to Marcus, "but I think you should know that several of us have been recording this entire exchange. Your behavior has been absolutely disgraceful." A woman holding the hand of a young boy added her voice to the growing chorus of disapproval. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she said firmly. "This man served his country with honor, and you're treating him like garbage. What kind of example do you think you're setting?" Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward these strangers who were standing up for her father. She could see that their support meant something to James, who had spent so many months feeling isolated and uncertain about his place in the world after his injury. The spontaneous defense from complete strangers seemed to remind him that most people still understood the value of service and sacrifice. Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him and seemed to realize for the first time that he had badly misjudged the situation. Instead of finding supporters for his crude humor, he had managed to unite a diverse group of tourists in condemnation of his behavior. His friends were looking increasingly uncomfortable, and several of them had started to edge away from him entirely. James sensed the shift in momentum and made a decision that would define how the encounter concluded. Rather than pressing his advantage or allowing the crowd's anger to escalate the situation further, he chose to demonstrate the kind of leadership that had made him an effective military officer. His next words were directed not at Marcus, but at the crowd that had gathered to support him. "I appreciate your support," James said clearly, his voice carrying easily across the immediate area. "But I didn't serve my country so that I could watch citizens turn against each other in the streets, even when one of them is behaving poorly. This gentleman is clearly having a difficult day, and I think he's probably said some things he's going to regret when he sobers up." The unexpected grace in James's response seemed to surprise everyone, including Marcus himself. The veteran's willingness to show mercy even after being subjected to such cruel treatment demonstrated a kind of strength that was impossible to ignore. Several people in the crowd exchanged glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something remarkable. Margaret nodded approvingly at James's response, her own military family background helping her recognize the kind of leadership that put principle above personal satisfaction. That's very generous of you, she said quietly, though I'm not sure this young man deserves such consideration. One of the royal guards, a young man who had been maintaining his ceremonial position throughout the confrontation, allowed his eyes to focus briefly on James. The look that passed between the two soldiers, one active, one retired, one British, one foreign, carried a recognition that transcended nationality or circumstance. Military service created bonds that civilian observers could appreciate but never fully understand. Sarah lowered her phone, sensing that the confrontation was moving toward its conclusion. She had captured enough evidence of the harassment to satisfy her protective instincts, but, more importantly, she had witnessed her father handle an impossible situation with exactly the kind of grace and strength that had made her proud to be his daughter throughout his recovery. Marcus stood in the center of the disapproving crowd, his earlier confidence completely deflated. The alcohol that had fueled his aggressive behavior seemed to be wearing off, replaced by a dawning awareness of how poorly he had behaved in front of dozens of witnesses. His friends had largely abandoned him, stepping away to distance themselves from his actions. The businessman who had first spoken up approached James directly, extending his hand in a gesture of respect. "Sir," he said formally, "I want to thank you for your service, and I want to apologize for what you've had to endure today. Your response has been remarkable." Other members of the crowd began to echo similar sentiments, creating an impromptu receiving line of people who wanted to express their appreciation for James's service and their admiration for how he had handled the confrontation. The veteran found himself shaking hands with tourists from several different countries, all of whom seemed to understand that they had witnessed something significant. Marcus watched this spontaneous demonstration of respect with growing awareness of how badly he had misjudged the situation. What he had intended as an easy target for his cruel humor had turned into a teaching moment that exposed his own character flaws to a crowd of strangers. The isolation he felt in that moment was complete and well-deserved. The ceremony in the background was reaching its formal conclusion, with the guards performing their final movements with the same precision they had maintained throughout the disruption. James turned his attention back to the spectacle, his mission of witnessing this tradition finally able to proceed without interference. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting warm light across the palace courtyard and highlighting the bright colors of the military uniforms. Margaret moved to stand beside James as the crowd began to disperse, her voice carrying quiet satisfaction. "Your father would have been proud," she said simply. That was exactly how an officer and gentleman should handle such a situation. Sarah felt tears of pride threatening to blur her vision as she watched her father's attention return to the ceremony he had come so far to see. The confrontation that had threatened to ruin their perfect morning had instead become a demonstration of everything she admired most about the man who had raised her. His strength, his dignity, his unwillingness to be diminished by someone else's cruelty, all of it had been on display for the world to see. The royal guards completed their ceremony and began their measured march back to their posts, their duty accomplished with the same excellence they brought to every performance of this ancient ritual. As they passed close to where James stood, one of the younger guards allowed his eyes to meet the veteran's for just a moment, a brief acknowledgement between soldiers that spoke volumes about mutual respect and shared understanding. Marcus and his remaining friends had begun to slink away from the area, their earlier bravado completely deflated by the morning's events. The man who had seemed so confident in his cruelty now appeared small and ashamed, his departure marking the end of an encounter that none of the witnesses would soon forget. As the immediate crowd began to disperse following the ceremony, James found himself at the center of something he had never expected, a gathering of complete strangers who seemed genuinely moved by what they had witnessed. The businessman who had first defended him lingered nearby, clearly wanting to continue their conversation. Margaret remained at his side, her protective instincts still engaged despite the departure of Marcus and his friends. "I hope you don't mind me asking," the businessman said, extending his hand properly for the first time, "but I'm Robert Chen. My father served in the British Army, and I've always had tremendous respect for military families. What you demonstrated here today, that was extraordinary leadership under pressure." James shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested Robert's military family background had instilled certain values. "James Mitchell," he replied. "And, thank you, though I'm not sure I did anything particularly extraordinary. I just tried to handle a difficult situation the way I was trained to handle difficult situations." Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement. Her father had been so worried about how people would react to his disability, so concerned that his injury somehow diminished his worth or his ability to contribute to society. Yet here he was, surrounded by strangers who clearly saw him as someone to be admired rather than pitied. The transformation in his posture and demeanor was remarkable. He stood straighter, spoke more confidently, seemed more like the man she remembered from before his injury. Margaret touched James's arm gently, drawing his attention. "I wonder if you might have time for a cup of tea," she said. "There's a lovely cafe just down the mall, and I have a feeling there are some people here who would very much like to hear more about your experiences. Not the painful parts," she added quickly, "but perhaps some of the positive aspects of military service that people don't always understand." The invitation seemed to surprise James, but Sarah could see that he was genuinely touched by the offer. The isolation he had felt during his recovery had been one of the most difficult aspects of his transition to civilian life. Most of his old friends had struggled to relate to his new circumstances, and making new connections had proven challenging when he was dealing with his own physical and emotional recovery. Robert nodded enthusiastically at Margaret's suggestion. "I would be honored to join you, if you don't mind. My company actually works with several veteran support organizations, and I have to admit, I don't often get the chance to hear first-hand accounts from someone who has served overseas." A woman who had been part of the supportive crowd approached hesitantly, her teenage daughter beside her. "Excuse me," she said with a slight accent that suggested she was not a native English speaker. "My name is Anna, and this is my daughter Petra. We are visiting from Germany. Petra is writing a school report about international military cooperation, and we could not help but overhear some of your conversation. Would it be possible for her to ask you a few questions?" James looked at the teenager, who appeared nervous but determined. He remembered being her age and being fascinated by military history and the stories of people who had served. "Of course," he said warmly. "I'd be happy to help with your report, though I should warn you that my German is pretty terrible." Petra smiled for the first time since approaching. "Oh, my English is much better than your German, I promise," she said with obvious relief. "I have been studying military history, and I am particularly interested in how soldiers from different countries work together during peacekeeping missions." The group began walking slowly toward the cafe Margaret had mentioned, their conversation flowing naturally despite the diverse backgrounds represented. James found himself genuinely enjoying the discussion, drawing on memories and experiences that he had not shared with anyone outside his immediate family since his retirement from service. Sarah walked slightly behind the group, continuing to document the encounter with her camera but also simply observing her father's transformation. The man who had been so uncertain about his place in the world just hours before was now confidently sharing his knowledge and experiences with people who genuinely valued his perspective. The contrast was remarkable and deeply moving. As they reached the cafe, a small establishment with outdoor seating that provided a perfect view of the palace grounds, James noticed one of the royal guards who had been part of the ceremony. The young soldier was off duty now, having completed his ceremonial responsibilities, and was walking in civilian clothes toward what appeared to be a nearby bus stop. On impulse, James called out to him. "Excuse me," he said clearly. "Could I have a word?" The guard stopped and turned, his expression curious but professional. Up close, he appeared even younger than James had initially thought, probably in his early 20s with the kind of earnest demeanor that suggested he took his responsibilities very seriously. "Sir," the young man said, his voice carrying the crisp pronunciation of someone trained in military protocol. "I wanted to thank you," James said simply. "I noticed you maintaining awareness of the situation in the crowd while you were on duty. That kind of professionalism and attention to detail, it reminds me of the soldiers I was privileged to serve with. Your unit should be proud." The guard's expression softened slightly, though his posture remained military straight. "Thank you, sir. I couldn't help but overhear some of what happened, and if I may say so, the way you handled that situation was exactly what they teach us about maintaining dignity under pressure." "Were you military yourself? British Army?" James asked, then answered the young man's question. "American Army, actually. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Retired now, obviously," he added with a slight gesture toward his prosthetic leg. The guard's demeanor shifted noticeably, taking on the particular respect that serving soldiers showed to combat veterans. Afghanistan, he repeated. Helmand Province? Among other places, James confirmed. Dangerous country, but beautiful people. Some of the bravest individuals I ever met were Afghan interpreters who risked everything to help coalition forces. Robert, who had been listening to this exchange with obvious fascination, stepped forward. I hope you don't mind the interruption, he said to the guard, but would you be interested in joining us for tea? I think we're having an impromptu discussion about military service, and it might be interesting to get a current perspective. The young soldier looked surprised by the invitation but pleased. I'd like that very much, he said. My name is Private Harrison, by the way. James Harrison. James Mitchell, the veteran replied with a smile. Looks like we share a name as well as a profession. Margaret had secured a large table on the cafe's terrace, and the unlikely group settled in for what would become an extended conversation about military service, international cooperation, and the challenges facing veterans in civilian society. The morning sun had warmed the air considerably, and the atmosphere around the table was relaxed and genuinely friendly. Petra, the German teenager, proved to be an enthusiastic and well-informed interviewer. Her questions about joint operations and international military cooperation drew out stories from both James and Private Harrison, creating an informal educational session that was clearly valuable for her research project but also enlightening for the other adults at the table. I think what people don't always understand, James found himself explaining, is that military service creates bonds that transcend national boundaries. When you're working with soldiers from other countries toward a common goal, you realize that the commitment to service and the willingness to sacrifice for something larger than yourself, those are universal values. Private Harrison nodded enthusiastically. Exactly, he said. During joint training exercises, you work with American soldiers, German soldiers, French soldiers, and within hours you realize that you all share the same basic values and commitment. The uniforms and accents might be different, but the dedication is identical. Anna, Petra's mother, had been listening intently to the conversation. This is exactly what Petra needed to understand for her report, she said gratefully. The textbooks explain the political aspects of military cooperation, but they don't capture the human element that makes it work. Sarah found herself taking fewer photographs and participating more actively in the conversation. Her father's enthusiasm was infectious, and she was learning things about his military experience that he had never shared with her before. The social setting seemed to make it easier for him to discuss aspects of his service that had been too difficult to talk about in the more clinical environment of family conversations. Margaret, who had clearly appointed herself as the unofficial moderator of the discussion, kept the conversation flowing smoothly and ensured that everyone had opportunities to contribute their perspectives. Her knowledge of British military history provided valuable context for some of the stories being shared, and her genuine interest in the experiences of younger service members created a bridge between generations. As the conversation continued, other cafe patrons began to take notice of the animated discussion taking place at their table. Several people approached to express their appreciation for military service, and a few shared their own family connections to the armed forces. What had started as a small gathering had evolved into something approaching a community event. Robert proved to be more than just a curious civilian with military family connections. His business involved working with veteran employment programs, and he was able to offer valuable insights about the challenges facing service members transitioning to civilian careers. The conversation naturally turned to practical matters of veteran support and advocacy. One of the biggest challenges, James found himself explaining, is that civilian employers often don't understand how to translate military experience into civilian job skills. They see combat veteran and think potential problem, when they should be thinking proven leadership under pressure. Private Harrison, who was obviously thinking about his own future beyond military service, listened intently to this part of the discussion. That's something I worry about, he admitted. I know I'm developing valuable skills in the military, but I'm not always sure how to explain those skills to civilian employers. Robert pulled out his business card and handed it to the young soldier. When you're ready to make that transition, he said, please get in touch. My company specifically recruits veterans because we understand the value of military training and experience. The generous offer seemed to surprise Private Harrison, but he accepted the card gratefully. The networking opportunity that had emerged from a chance encounter demonstrated the value of the connections being forged around the table. Petra had been taking careful notes throughout the conversation, and she looked up from her notebook with obvious excitement. "This has been incredibly helpful," she said. "Would it be possible for me to quote some of what you've said in my report? I think my classmates would find these perspectives really interesting." James nodded his agreement, pleased to contribute to the education of someone genuinely interested in understanding military service. "Of course," he said. "Just remember to include the positive aspects of international cooperation alongside any challenges you discuss. Military service can be difficult, but it's also one of the most rewarding experiences a person can have." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering topics from military history to veteran healthcare to the role of armed forces in modern society. The diverse perspectives represented around the table created a rich and nuanced discussion that none of the participants could have anticipated when they woke up that morning. As the afternoon progressed and people began to think about their other commitments, the group started to exchange contact information and make plans to stay in touch. What had begun as a chance encounter during a tourist ceremony had evolved into genuine friendships based on shared values and mutual respect. Private Harrison was the first to excuse himself, needing to return to base for afternoon duties. Before leaving, he shook hands with everyone around the table, lingering longest with James. "Thank you for what you said back there," he said quietly. "About maintaining dignity under pressure. I'll remember that." James gripped the young soldier's hand firmly. "You already know how to do it," he said. "I could see it in how you handled yourself during the ceremony. Just remember that the same principles that make you a good soldier will make you a good civilian when the time comes." The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the cafe terrace when the group finally began to disperse, each member carrying away something valuable from their unexpected encounter. James felt a lightness in his chest that he had not experienced since before his injury, the satisfaction of meaningful connection and the renewed confidence that comes from discovering your experiences have value to others. Margaret was among the last to leave, having clearly enjoyed her role as the elder stateswoman of their impromptu gathering. Before departing, she pressed a small card into James's hand. "This has my contact information," she said warmly. "My late husband would have loved this conversation, and I hope we can continue it sometime. There's a veteran support group that meets monthly near where I live, nothing formal or depressing, just good people sharing experiences and staying connected. You might find it interesting." Sarah watched her father accept the invitation with genuine enthusiasm, a dramatic change from his previous reluctance to engage with veteran support resources. The social nature of today's encounter seemed to have reminded him that connecting with other veterans could be about sharing strength rather than dwelling on struggles. Robert gathered his business materials and made sure both James and Sarah had his contact information. "I meant what I said about staying in touch," he told James. "My company is always looking for experienced military personnel who can help mentor younger veterans making the transition to civilian careers. If you're ever interested in that kind of work, even on a part-time basis, I'd love to discuss it with you." The offer represented something James had not considered, the possibility that his military experience and recent struggles with disability could actually qualify him to help other veterans facing similar challenges. The idea of turning his hardships into something constructive for others appealed to him immediately. Anna and Petra prepared to continue their London sightseeing, but not before Petra had thoroughly documented everyone's contact information for potential follow-up questions about her research project. "This has been the best part of our entire trip," Anna confided to Sarah. Petra has been worried about her report, but now she has real stories from real people. You cannot get that kind of authenticity from textbooks. As the group finally separated, with promises to stay in touch and plans for future meetings, James and Sarah found themselves alone together for the first time since the morning's events began to unfold. They walked slowly back toward the palace, retracing their steps from earlier in the day when everything had seemed much more uncertain and fragile. "Dad," Sarah said quietly as they approached the spot where the confrontation with Marcus had occurred, I am so proud of how you handled that situation. But, more than that, I'm amazed by what happened afterward. Did you see how people responded to you? How much they valued hearing your perspective?" James nodded thoughtfully, still processing the day's events himself. "I have to admit, it wasn't what I expected when we planned this trip. I thought I might feel out of place here, like I didn't belong among all these tourists and traditions. Instead, I feel more connected to my military identity than I have since I retired." They paused near the palace railings, the same spot where they had begun their morning as spectators at a ceremonial changing of the guard. The symbolic nature of the location was not lost on either of them. They were ending their day at the same place where it had begun, but as fundamentally different people carrying new possibilities and connections. "I keep thinking about something Robert said," James continued. "About using my experience to help other veterans. I never considered that my struggles with adjustment might actually qualify me to help someone else rather than just being something I needed to overcome privately." Sarah smiled at her father's growing enthusiasm. "You've always been a leader, Dad. Just because you're not in uniform anymore doesn't mean those leadership skills disappeared. Today proved that you still have the ability to inspire people and bring out the best in difficult situations." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a familiar figure, Private Harrison, who had returned to the area still wearing his civilian clothes but carrying a small package. He approached them somewhat hesitantly, clearly having sought them out specifically. "I hope you don't mind," he said to James, "but I wanted to give you something before you left London. It's not much, just a small token from the regiment." He handed over the package, which proved to contain a ceremonial patch from the Royal Guard unit along with a brief note of appreciation. James was visibly moved by the gesture, understanding immediately the significance of receiving recognition from an active military unit. "This is incredibly generous," he said, examining the patch carefully. "I'm honored to receive this." "It was the least we could do," Private Harrison replied. "Word spread pretty quickly about what happened this morning and how you handled it. The commanding officer wanted you to know that your behavior reflected credit on all military personnel, regardless of nationality. We recognize leadership when we see it." The young soldier's words carried particular weight because they represented official acknowledgement from an active military unit that James's actions had been worthy of professional respect. For someone who had been struggling with questions about his continued value and identity, such recognition was profoundly meaningful. After Private Harrison departed for the second time, James and Sarah continued their walk through the area surrounding Buckingham Palace, both of them reflecting on the unexpected turns their day had taken. The tourist crowds had thinned considerably, creating a more peaceful atmosphere that seemed conducive to thoughtful conversation. "You know what strikes me most about today?" Sarah said as they found a bench overlooking the palace grounds. "It wasn't just that you stood up to that bully, though that was important. It was how you turned a negative situation into something positive for everyone involved. Even Marcus probably learned something, though he might not admit it." James considered his daughter's observation carefully. "I suppose military training teaches you to look for opportunities to accomplish your mission even when circumstances aren't ideal. Today my mission was to see the changing of the guard and spend quality time with my daughter. Everything else was just obstacles to overcome." The simple clarity of his perspective surprised Sarah, who had been thinking of the morning's events in much more dramatic terms. Her father's ability to maintain focus on his primary objectives while dealing with unexpected challenges seemed like a perfect example of the kind of practical leadership that had made him an effective military officer. As evening approached, they began making their way back toward their hotel, both carrying business cards, phone numbers, and plans for future meetings that had been unimaginable when they started their day. The chance encounters that had emerged from a confrontation with a bully had created a network of connections that promised to enrich both of their lives going forward. "I've been thinking about what Margaret said," James mentioned as they waited for their bus. "About that veterans support group. I think I'd like to attend one of their meetings when we get back home. Not because I need support, necessarily, but because I might have something to offer." Sarah felt a surge of pride at her father's words. The transformation from feeling like a burden to recognizing himself as someone with valuable contributions to make represented a fundamental shift in his self-perception. Today's events had reminded him that his experiences, including his struggles, had value that could benefit others. The bus ride back to their hotel was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the day's events. Sarah reviewed the photographs and video she had captured, marveling at how completely the narrative had changed from documentation of harassment to celebration of unexpected friendships and opportunities. James found himself thinking about the various people they had met and the different ways their military connections had created immediate bonds of understanding and respect. The universality of military values across national boundaries had been demonstrated in the most personal and immediate way possible. Back in their hotel room that evening, Sarah helped her father organize the contact information they had collected and plan follow-up communications with their new friends. The business card from Robert's company went into a place of honor in James's wallet, representing possibilities he had not considered before today. "I want to send a proper thank you note to Private Harrison and his unit," James said as they planned their next day's activities. "That patch they gave me, that's going to be displayed prominently when we get home. It represents something important about recognition and respect between soldiers." The ceremonial patch had indeed taken on special significance, representing not just the kindness of strangers but official acknowledgement that James's values and behavior continued to reflect credit on the military profession even after his retirement from active service. As they prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on how completely their trip had exceeded her original expectations. She had hoped to help her father feel more confident and connected to his military identity. Instead, she had witnessed his transformation from uncertainty to renewed purpose, from isolation to meaningful community connections. "Dad," she said as they said goodnight, "I know this trip was supposed to be about seeing the sights and having a nice time together. But I think something much more important happened today. I think you found your way back to yourself." James smiled at his daughter's observation, understanding exactly what she meant. The man who went to bed that night was fundamentally the same person who had woken up that morning, but he carried himself differently now. The dignity and strength that had always been part of his character had been validated and celebrated by complete strangers who recognized those qualities immediately. The last thing he did before sleep was to place the Royal Guard patch on his nightstand where he could see it first thing in the morning. Tomorrow they would continue their London adventure, but they would do so as different people, more confident, more connected, and more aware of the positive impact that military values could have in civilian settings. The morning's confrontation with Marcus, which could have been a deeply negative experience, had instead become the catalyst for discoveries about community, respect, and the enduring value of military service. Sometimes the most profound lessons emerge from the most unexpected encounters, and sometimes standing up to a bully becomes the first step toward finding your place in a larger community of people who share your values. James fell asleep that night planning his first letter to Margaret's veterans group, eager to explore how his experiences might benefit others who were navigating similar challenges. The isolation he had felt during his recovery seemed like a distant memory, replaced by excitement about new possibilities and connections that promised to enrich his civilian life in ways he was only beginning to imagine. The disabled veteran who had been targeted by a bully in full view of the Royal Guard had discovered something invaluable, that his worth was not diminished by his injury, that his experiences had value to others, and that the strength he had shown in military service was exactly the same strength he could bring to civilian challenges. The guard who had witnessed his dignity under pressure had seen a perfect example of the values they were trained to uphold, and the community that had formed around their encounter had demonstrated the best of human nature in response to conflict. In the end, Marcus the bully had accomplished something he never intended. He had created the circumstances that allowed a disabled veteran to rediscover his strength, find his community, and recognize that his best days of service might still be ahead of him.